All right, group, let's go ahead and tackle Unit 5, where we're going to talk about the origin and evolution of microorganisms, and we'll also talk a little bit about adaptation and natural selection. This information, of course, becomes important in clinical microbiology when you're trying to understand how to identify an organism and when you're trying to understand biodiversity, including resistant organisms. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and microorganisms likely have been around for 3.5 to 4 billion years or so. In fact, 3.5 billion years ago, the chemoautotrophs made energy from CO2, then glycolytic organisms started to appear. Still, the oldest living thing is seagrass of the Mediterranean. There's a plant that is there that has been unchanged and is still alive after 200,000 years. In the beginning, Earth was dominated by volcanoes, oceans, and a turbulent atmosphere. Chemical alterations and activity occurred forming organic matter, and that would be carbon-containing matter. Elements formed from the volcanoes and the oceans, and these molecules were amino acids, sugars, and nucleotides, the building blocks of life. That's basically DNA. Plant and animal life began only 550 million years ago, insects about 450 million years ago, and anatomically modern humans over about 200,000 years. So our biodiversity has changed dramatically because of three significant extinction events. 2.4 billion years ago, 252 million years ago, and 66 million years ago. The second clinically significant extinction event was 252 million years ago, when 90% of all the species perished due to an asteroid or volcanic event. And then there was another extinction disaster that happened 66 million years ago, when the volcanoes and floods killed 50% of life, including the dinosaurs. Organic molecules are the building blocks for life, including sugars and amino acids and nucleotides. Sugars are also known as carbohydrates. These are structures of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. They store carbon and are the source of energy for many living things. Amino acids, they form proteins and are used for the structure and function of microbial cells. Some examples of amino acids, there are 20 in all. But they're all proteins, and they all contain an amine or a carboxyl unit. Okay, but some examples of amino acids would be arginine, lysine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, tyrosine, and valine. Now, a nucleotide is basically a structure of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, nitrogen and phosphorus. It's used in the storage of genetic information. So a purine and a pyrimidine linked together would be examples of nucleotides in DNA. The next information is taken from The Evolution of Complexity by Means of Natural Selection by John Tyler Bonner and Natural Selection, Domains, Levels, and Challenges by George Christopher Williams. The concept of evolution implies that living things gradually change over millions of years. The premise is that each species has not been created independently, but descended from each other. The result is structural and functional changes in the organism over many generations. Ribosomal RNA sequencing shows three distinct cell lines: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Those are domains. The archaea are single-celled microorganisms like plankton. They are similar to bacteria but have pseudopeptidoglycan in the cell membrane. Most scientists of today believe that RNA was the original genetic information in primitive cells. Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, and he hypothesized that each species was not independently created but have actually descended from another species. He made his hypothesis based on embryological relations, geographical distributions, and geological succession. Okay? He believed the origin of species was not just dependent on fluctuations or differences in external sources like food and the environment. Darwin believed there is a struggle for existence and that many more species are born that can possibly survive. Some species thrive under varying conditions in life. Selected varieties are more likely to propagate its species in a new or modified form. This is termed natural selection. So an example of natural selected is when selected varieties will be more likely to propagate its species in the modified form. So an example of that would be spotted moths. Originally these moths were white and they blended in with birch trees, but then coal became a source of energy in the world, and the birch trees got black bark, and so the spotted moth is now blacker. It's actually adapted to its surroundings. Darwin described natural selection as a system of corrective feedback that favors those individuals most able to organize in their ecological niche. The reproductive success and failures of organisms and populations determines the future prevalence of better genes in the future. Some believe that adaptations within a species will cease when further adaptation results in an arbitrary or maladaptive characteristic. Okay, that's why the spine of the giraffe and the spine of a mouse are very similar to one another. All 7 vertebrae in the spine of the giraffe versus the spine of the mouse are functionally identical. A trait being selected for is based on the gene. Gene in this situation does not mean DNA, but any random information on a molecule. DNA is made from matter, and it has mass and charge, and genes are the units of selection. Replication of genetic material is like making a photocopy. The copy appears to be just like the first one, however, on the second one, the page is different, the ink is different, and things like that. This is called replicator interaction. Distinction of selection. This allows for adaptation in organisms, especially higher mammals like humans. And that was according to Brandon and Sober in 1980. Variation within a species does occur, and it is influenced by transition difficulties the species encounters. These difficulties may actually improve or hinder the species. Variation within a species is also influenced by the instinct of the species and hybridism of the species. How successful will the hybrid be? There are close parallels between organization of cells in the body and individuals in a society. Natural selection acts on both levels that are listed above. Natural selection acts on the organization of cells inside an individual and individuals among society. Behavior can be classified in 2 ways, and that's called flexible behavior or inflexible behavior. Flexible behavior I think of more as nurture, the ability of an animal to learn and or teach because of nurturing. Inflexible behavior I refer to more as nature. It is behavior that is directly controlled by our genes. Genetic mutations don't just happen for no reason at all. Mutations develop over time that will address a need of the species. Gene mutations don't hinder the reproduction of the species. It doesn't lead to extinction. And finally, a gradual, and this would be over hundreds of years, a gradual change is seen in the entire population as evolution occurs. The gaseous conditions of the Earth, or the atmospheric oxygen available on Earth, has led to quite a bit of microbial diversity. Atmospheric oxygen availability led to increasing diversity of these organisms. So 2.4 billion years ago, the oxygen content was pretty low at only 0.1%. Okay, now it's about 21 to 22% oxygen in ambient or untreated environmental air. But you can see over 1.5 billion years ago, the oxygen was about 10%, and 0.9 billion years ago, the oxygen was 21%, which is pretty much the amount today, 21 to 22%. With the availability of more oxygen, oxidizing organisms increased because more energy was available to them via aerobic respiration. When organisms live together where at least one member is affected positively by the relationship, that is called symbiosis. Normal flora is symbiotic or mutual. Bacteria gets its nutrients. We get bilirubin that is reduced to urobilinogen, and we also get the synthesis of vitamin K. So our normal flora that lives on or within us are considered symbiotic organisms. Mutualism is when organisms living within the host, organisms live with the host and both benefits. Bacteria have evolved diverse mechanisms for gaining entry and proliferation within the tissues and human cells. They can do that with either pili or adhesions. This symbiotic relationship of microbe and host will either harm or benefit the host, normal flora versus pathogen. One type of bacterial evolution is when bacteria formerly living independently now colonize the human host. This is usually considered a biofilm or colonization. Bacteria must be able to compete with other microbes, evade the host's immune system, and use resources that are on or within the host, and finally gain transmission to a new host in order for it to become an infectious disease. So an organism has to be able to evade cellular and humoral immunity of the upcoming host. Molecular phylogeny is the study of gene and protein sequences to determine the relatedness among organisms. Here we are looking at genetic or protein markers for degrees of similarity among organisms. Okay? Speciation is the process by which organisms evolve. So Staphylococcus versus Staphylococcus aureus versus Staphylococcus epidermidis, they evolved into different species. That's speciation. Bacterial speciation is a product of vertical inheritance or binary fission and horizontal gene transfer, conjugation, transformation, and transduction. When a minimum of 70% of an organism's DNA is starting to be hybridized, it is considered a new species at that point. So there's a lot of organism diversity in the world. We have the three domains, which are bacteria, archaea, and the eukaryotes. Archaea are the single-celled microbes. They're similar to bacteria, but they live in extreme environments like hot springs and glaciers. Okay, their cell membrane is a little bit different than bacterial cell membranes. Eukaryotes include algae, fungi, and protozoans. These are generally multicellular, and often fungi and protozoans are pathogenic to humans. So just keep in mind, microbes are everywhere in the environment, but they play a very important role in the decomposition of organic matter, and they actually return things like nitrogen, other minerals, and nutrients to the soil. Remember, consider the role of bacteria in the cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur. Microbes can interact with other organisms in a community as free living or as biofilms. This interaction results in the benefit or harm of the host organism. Organisms that interact with the host and colonize in high numbers and produce virulence factors can cause disease. Some of those virulence factors would be things like pili, capsules, toxins, and enzymes. Diseases that are communicable are referred to as infectious diseases, and they can be controlled by aseptic technique or using sterile technique, antimicrobial drugs like antibiotics, and immunization or vaccines. So diseases can spread through food that is contaminated, water that is contaminated, or through the air. So foodborne diseases would be the consumption of food that is contaminated with pathogenic organisms. So the way that we prevent getting Salmonella, Shigella, or E. coli 0157H7 is by hand washing, keeping our raw and cooked foods away from each other, making sure that we're cooking foods at the correct temperatures, that we store them properly, and clean up our food prep surfaces thoroughly. Waterborne diseases can be spread by fecally contaminated water and other contaminants that are in the water. We want to avoid drinking, swimming, or bathing in flood waters. Do not expose open wounds to flood waters. We want to monitor water supplies frequently and make sure that we're drinking only purified water. We also want to clean our fruit and vegetables with purified water. And then finally, our last category of how to get an infectious disease would be through the airborne route. So if a disease is transmitted through coughing, sneezing, or talking, we do need to be mindful of that. So to prevent aerosols, we always want to use aerosol precautions. We want to avoid contact with others while we're sick and definitely cover the mouth while coughing, sneezing, or talking. So that's 3 ways to avoid disease transmission: the prevention of foodborne diseases, the prevention of waterborne diseases, and the prevention of airborne diseases. So, this has been Unit 5, where we talked about the origin and evolution of microorganisms, and we talked a little bit about adaptation and natural selection. Beat that anxious feeling. Choose some new behaviors like relaxing and deeply breathing. Reframe things as yourself. Can I live with the worst case? Ask yourself, can I live with the worst case scenario? And finally, assume the best and prepare thoroughly. So those are ways that you can reduce anxious feelings in your life.